The story begins in the ancient city of Alexandria, where the sun's light once danced upon marble streets and towering libraries whispered the knowledge of centuries. At its heart lived a woman unlike any other, Hypatia, the philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer whose brilliance defied the boundaries of her time. In an age when women were silenced, Hypatia's voice rose in lecture halls, drawing students from across the Mediterranean. She taught of the stars, of numbers, of the harmony of the cosmos, weaving logic with wonder. To some, she was a beacon of reason, a guardian of wisdom at a time when the Roman Empire staggered on uncertain feet. But to others, her very existence was an act of defiance, a challenge to faith and power. The world around Hypatia was changing. Alexandria, once the crown of knowledge, had become a battlefield of faiths, where pagans, Christians, and Jews clashed in streets stained with blood. The libraries were no longer sanctuaries but targets, symbols of old gods and forbidden truths. In this crucible of unrest, Hypatia's devotion to philosophy became dangerous. She counseled governors and debated bishops, her words sharp as blades, her presence a reminder that knowledge could not be bound by scripture. The crowds revered her, but the rising tide of zealotry saw her as a threat. For in a world where faith demanded obedience, a woman teaching reason was not only a heretic, she was a challenge to authority itself. Rumors began to spread, whispered first in churches and then shouted in the streets. They said Hypatia practiced sorcery, that her scrolls contained forbidden magic, that her mind was guided not by gods but by demons. These were lies, crafted not by chance but by envy and fear. Leaders of the Christian community saw her influence over Orestes, the Roman governor, as a barrier to their control. And so, seeds of hate were sown, watered by ignorance, and fanned into flames by those who craved power more than truth. The woman who once stood above the city as its brightest star was now cast in shadows of suspicion. It was in the spring of 415 AD when tension reached its breaking point. The streets of Alexandria boiled with unrest, mobs stirred by sermons that branded Hypatia as the enemy of Christ. She rode her chariot through the city as she often did, her presence calm, her robes flowing like the philosophers of old. But eyes followed her not with admiration, but with fury. Whispers turned into shouts, and shouts into threats. The tide of history had turned against her, and she was about to meet a fate so brutal, it would forever scar the memory of Alexandria. The mob came for her with the fury of a storm. They were not philosophers or seekers of truth, but men blinded by rage, their hands armed with stones, clubs, and the weight of superstition. Hypatia's chariot was halted in the streets, her students scattered in terror as the cries of witch and enemy of Christ echoed off the walls of Alexandria. She was dragged from her seat, her garments torn away, her dignity stripped before the eyes of a city she had once illuminated with knowledge. The temple of reason fell silent as the noise of hatred drowned all else. They carried her into the great Caesareum, once a temple to the gods, now claimed by the church and turned into a stage for vengeance. There, beneath marble columns that had seen centuries of worship, the mob unleashed its cruelty. Shells, shards of pottery, and jagged stones were their weapons, sharp edges tearing into her skin. Each strike was not only against her body but against everything she represented, logic, tolerance, and the dangerous freedom of the human mind. Her screams were lost in the roar of the crowd, her blood staining the sacred floor where philosophy was condemned by ignorance. It was not enough to kill her. The frenzy demanded more. They stripped the flesh from her bones, their hands stained with the gore of their own making. What had once been a woman of wisdom, who gazed at the heavens and taught of stars, was reduced to a brutal spectacle. Her body was torn apart piece by piece, scattered by those who believed they were serving righteousness, though in truth they served only the darkest hunger for power. When the mob was done, silence returned to the Caesareum. The columns still stood, but they no longer bore witness to worship, they bore witness to murder. The air was heavy with smoke and blood, with the memory of a philosopher who dared to stand against the tides of zealotry. Outside, the city seemed unchanged, the marketplace bustled, and the sea still touched Alexandria's harbor, but something had died within its heart. The death of Hypatia was not merely the death of a woman, it was the death of an age when reason could still challenge faith, when words were sharper than swords. Her remains were carried through the streets, not as a body but as fragments, a grim procession that turned wisdom into ashes. In their victory, the mob believed they had silenced a heretic. In truth, they had silenced the last great voice of Alexandria's ancient world, and in her place, they left only shadows where once there had been light. The days after Hypatia's death were filled with an uneasy silence, as if even the city of Alexandria mourned what had been lost. Word of her fate spread quickly, carried beyond the city walls into the far reaches of the crumbling Roman Empire. Some whispered in fear of the mob's power, others in sorrow at the extinguishing of a great mind. Yet the leaders who had stirred the frenzy remained silent, their hands washed of blood while the echoes of their sermons lingered in the ears of the faithful. For the people, Hypatia became both a warning and a curse, proof that knowledge could be dangerous, that to rise above one's station was to invite ruin. But history does not easily forget. Those who survived her lectures carried her words in memory, passing them on like forbidden fire. To her students, she was not only a philosopher but a symbol of defiance, a woman who chose reason over fear, logic over submission. Her murder revealed more than just cruelty. It revealed the fragility of a world caught between light and darkness, knowledge and ignorance, freedom and fanaticism. With each retelling, the brutality of her end stood not as a triumph of faith, but as a reminder of how fear corrupts justice and how power, when unchecked, devours wisdom. The fate of Hypatia marked more than the death of one philosopher, it was the end of an age. Alexandria, once the jewel of learning, slowly dimmed. Its great library was gone, its scholars scattered, its spirit of inquiry crushed beneath the weight of dogma. In the centuries that followed, Europe plunged into shadows where knowledge was chained, and only whispers of the ancients survived. The death of Hypatia became a symbol, her blood staining not only the stones of the Caesareum but the conscience of history itself. And yet, her spirit endured. Centuries later, thinkers and writers would resurrect her name, speaking of her as a martyr of philosophy, a woman who paid the highest price for daring to think freely. She became a ghost that haunted the corridors of power, a warning to tyrants and zealots that truth cannot be silenced forever. The mob had torn her body apart, but her legacy refused to be destroyed. In every classroom that values inquiry, in every mind that dares to question, the shadow of Hypatia still lingers. Her death was cruel, her fate unspeakable, but her life was luminous, a beacon that shines across centuries. The dark fate of Hypatia reminds us that knowledge is fragile, that reason must be defended, and that the cost of silence is far greater than the cost of truth. And so her story endures, not as the triumph of her enemies, but as the undying testament of a woman who looked to the stars and refused to look away, even as the world closed in around her.